Hi, my name is Ashley Marvel. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Picture Exchange Communication System, also known as PECS, so P-E-C-S. So PECS is an alternative form of communication, typically for individuals on the autism spectrum, but not always. It incorporates a social interaction component, and it uses picture icons instead of any sort of writing or typing for learners who may not have those skills just yet. So typically it's used with learners who have limited expressive communication. They typically lack some sort of functional communication, which can mean that they lack vocals, or they may have some vocals, they just may not be fully functional. So it sort of depends. It's very customizable, so it's something that can be used across a lot of learners, but typically they're learners with a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, and a lot of times it's used with young children just because it does incorporate those pictures instead of any sort of, there are words associated with the pictures, but the pictures are the primary indicator, or the SD for the child to understand sort of the contingency that's happening there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a PECS binder. So this is a binder that we have. It's actually from the PECS company, but a lot of people do choose to make their own. You can use, essentially you need a binder, you need some pages, and you need some Velcro and some sort of icons for your learner. But a lot of people do choose to make their own just because it is a little cheaper than going through the actual company. But I will say the company does make some really high quality products. So that's been something that the clinic that I work for has just chosen to go with. So for our binder, we have the actual binder. It's pretty small. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but it's smaller than a classroom binder or something like that, just to make it a little more portable for individuals who are using the PECS binder. You have pages. So each page is going to be a different color. You can definitely have more than one page of each color, just depending on your learner and what they're working on currently. But the pages typically represent, for us, we sort them by nouns, verbs, places, carrier phrases, but that's just sort of how we've decided to organize ours. It's something that is usually pretty easy for the learners to catch on to and distinguish. So we use orange for nouns, green for verbs, blue for places or prepositions, and then we usually use black for things like carrier phrases. And as your learner becomes more advanced, and if you choose to continue with PECS through an entire learning process, you will get to use some of the other pages as well for things like tacting or answering questions, those sort of things. But within our PECS binder, we have the sentence strip here. This is just something that's Velcroed on. This is where the learner actually places the icons. And then we do have these icons. So typically these are things that are reinforcing to the child at first. Like I said, nouns, verbs, places, those sort of things. And it sort of builds on itself as it goes. So you start very basic and sort of, work at the speed of your learner. So as far as training is concerned, PECS USA, the company that originally began making these materials, they offer training. I personally was trained via the BCBA at the clinic where I work, which I think is how a lot of registered behavior technicians or behavior technicians come across PECS training. And it is a bit of a process to start an individual with the PECS binder. There are 6 different phases. And it's important to note that not all learners will go through all of the phases. Some will, develop spontaneous vocals throughout the PECS process. Some will switch to something a little more high-tech, like, say, Proloquo to Go, or some sort of high-tech alternative communication device that you can use on an iPad, etc., etc. So those 6 phases, the first phase, you have to have 2 teachers. One who is communicating with the learner and one who is there to provide prompts as necessary. It's really important to start off with 2 different individuals so that the learner doesn't become prompt dependent on the individual who they are communicating with. Having that extra sort of shadow is really beneficial because they can fade out much easier. If I'm speaking directly with you and providing prompts to you face to face, it's a lot more difficult for me to fade out. But if someone can provide prompts from behind with a minimal verbal interaction, it's much easier for that individual to fade out and increase the independence of the learner throughout the process. So you want to start with those two teachers. And the first step is going to be using it for reinforcement. So you're going to want to start with 1, maybe 2. It sort of depends on the discrimination abilities of your client. But typically you start with a very 1 or 2 highly preferred reinforcers. So I know for some of my kiddos, the iPad is a really big deal. Puzzles, games, books, whatever the child's interest. You can make a PEC icon or several PEC icons to reflect those interests. So initially they're going to just be using it for manding. They're going to be pulling the PECS icons, and I'll show you the process here in just a little bit. But they'll go through the process to communicate their mands. The second phase of training involves delivering the sentence strip to the trainer from a little bit further of a distance. So I may start directly face-to-face with a client, very close. They're just handing it to me with very minimal motor effort. Over time, I'm going to want to increase my distance. That's sort of where that social interaction component comes into play. So, the child now has to seek me out because they understand that they are, communicating with me that they are wanting this item or action or place. So that's pretty awesome that you can get that social interaction component in addition to just the manding. So the third phase is going to be discrimination among various preferred and non-preferred in larger arrays. And that's something that you're going to just want to work up to depending on your learner. So some kids can easily right off the bat discriminate among 10 things and understand the difference. And so, for those kiddos, they can have a lot of PEC icons and, be picking all their different reinforcers. And some kids, it's just a little bit of a different process where they're just learning to identify the relationship between, this PEC icon and this reinforcer. So it just sort of depends on your learner, but you'll eventually want to work up to where they are having to discriminate amongst different icons, both preferred and non-preferred. So the step after that is that they start using the carrier phrases to communicate with sentences. So they can start off as simple as, I want iPad, and sort of graduate up to, I want the red squishies and the truck puzzle, or, much longer, more complex phrasing, whatever will fit on the sentence strip. After that, you get to answering questions. So the first question is always, what do you want? Answering questions about things in the environment. And then the final phase is commentary. So where a learner would be using the PECS binder to comment on things in the environment as opposed to just requesting things. I know that there's a lot of students who don't necessarily make it all the way through those phases just because in today's day and age, Pro Loquo to Go is something very similar to PECS, just via an iPad. So it's something that's a little more portable and something that a lot of people find to be a little easier to use. But the PECS binder is really the basis, the ground point. Before ever teaching a learner something like Pro Loquo, it's really great to have them start with, the PECS binder, just because it is something that's, broken down into smaller steps. So there are certainly some pros and some cons to the PECS, system. First of all, for pros, there are very limited prerequisites. As long as the child has the ability to see the PEC icons, that's really kind of all that's required. The motor skills to maybe pull it and put it on the sentence strip. But other than that, they don't need to have a verbal repertoire or anything like that. There's the social component, which is a huge pro. A lot of times, some alternative communication devices don't necessarily require the social component, so that's something pretty unique to PECS. You don't need speech of any kind. It's very, very customizable. So you're going to be making PEC icons. Once you make a set of PECs for one individual, you're going to probably have to make a completely different set of PECs for a different individual. It just depends on motivation and what you're working on with that particular learner at that time. It's very practical for therapeutic and home settings, a place where the learner can effectively communicate one-on-one with an individual. So it's very, very practical in those settings. And it's also great for transition, as I mentioned, to other, alternative communications like Proloquo or something like that. It gives them a good basis for discrimination and sort of understanding what an icon is and how different icons, equate to different reinforcement in the environment, things like that. It's also pretty inexpensive. If you don't choose to go the brand name PECS route, you can make something very similar for not a lot of money, and not a lot of effort too, which is something really important when translating, research into practical application. You want to make sure that it's something that doesn't require a lot of time, but is really efficient and really effective for your client, but hopefully also something that doesn't cost a lot of money. It's also very user-friendly. It's very easy to train individuals. Once a child is very comfortable using the PECS system and is not requiring a lot of error correction procedures, it's something that can be very easily taught to school personnel, or parents. So that's a really huge deal as well, so that a child is generalizing their communication in multiple settings. Some of the cons are that it is a little bulky. There are these, from the PECS company, they have these little, loops up here so you can attach a strap. But it is sort of cumbersome, especially if you're working with a very small child. It's not really practical for, a 2.5-year-old to carry around a binder. I know I've had to tie up the straps on some so that, it's not dragging across the ground for some of my smaller clients. But, what it has in bulkiness, it does make up for in functional communication. So that's something that's really great. Another con is that it is a little less practical for community settings. If you're at home or at a therapy environment, there's a lot more one-to-one interaction, but if you're out at the grocery store, sometimes PECS isn't always the best communication, just depending on the learner. Some learners will easily be able to take it to the grocery store and communicate via the PECS binder, and for some it's just they require a little more assistance and focus with the PECS binder, and so it's not as practical for those individuals in community settings. So I do want to talk a little bit about how to make the PEC icons before I show you an example of how to use the whole system. So I have two different types of PECS icons here. Typically we try to keep a border that is the same color as the page to sort of strengthen the matching skills of the client. A lot of our kids are really, really good with visual performance and matching, so that sort of helps out to keep things organized and let them know, these are verbs, these are nouns, these are places, those sort of things. What we've been doing, you of course need the Velcro to attach so that they can pull it off. My clinic, our office manager has been putting cardboard on the back of them, which has been super, super great because she does cardboard and then she does the picture and wraps them in clear tape, which is a little more time consuming than some other icon making methods, but for those little kiddos we have who are just a little, rough on supplies, they're very, very sturdy and they last a really long time. We've actually been able to reuse some of the PECS that we've used for previous clients who've graduated to a different type of communication. We've been able to reuse some of those PECS, so that's been something that's really great for our clinic personally. But a lot of people also choose to just, laminate, and that's another option as well. We found they're not quite as sturdy, but if you need to make a icon on the go, that's much more efficient. And you don't even necessarily need to laminate them. It just depends on how long you really want them to last. So it is a little important to make sure that they're sturdy, and also sort of managing your Velcro ratio so that the kiddos can pull them off if your kiddo's got some fine motor issues. Big Velcro that's very, very sticky is probably not going to be your best option just because it's going to be much more difficult, and we don't want to have any barriers for those kiddos. We want to make sure that it's as easy as possible for them to communicate and effective for them. So how you use the whole system is you want to make sure that you have some sort of motivating operation. So you want your kid to be wanting something in the environment. It can be spontaneous, it can be a little more contrived where you're giving a choice. It just sort of depends on what works best for your learner and the situation that you're using the PECS binder. But from beginning to end, what will happen is that the child will approach the binder. The child will find the icon that they are looking for. Like I mentioned earlier, the iPad is a really big hit with a lot of the kiddos that I see, so that's something that we see quite often. So the kiddo will pull the PEC from the page and place it onto the sentence strip. And then the kiddo will pull the sentence strip and deliver it to the trainer. So that's sort of that social interaction. They have to be seeking out the trainer in order to hand them that sentence strip before they're going to receive the reinforcement. So once they've delivered that to the trainer, the reinforcement is given immediately. For some kids, we have paired sign with the PECS. They've learned sign first and then graduated to the PECS, and so sometimes we try to make sure to prompt them for the sign before the PECS so that they don't lose the sign in the event that something happens, they leave the PECS binder at home, or it is a physical object, so who knows, especially with young children, what sort of tragedy might befall it. I've had a client who's dropped the PECS binder in the pool before, and so that was a little bit of a recovery process there. But having that sign language or something else has always been really beneficial as well, just for the situations where the PECS binder might not have been as functional as we would have liked, particularly in community settings and things like that. So, like I said, it can get as complicated as the learner will allow. So here on our black page, we have an I want icon. So if a child has gotten to the point where they are asking in sentences, they may pull the I want and then the iPad icon so that when they deliver it to the trainer, it will say, I want iPad. And often when it's delivered to the trainer also provides that vocal as well. So, we like to say, the learner hands you the sentence strip with the iPad, requesting the iPad. So we'll vocalize, iPad. Oh, you want the iPad when handing that reinforcement, just so for those kiddos that are, in the process of developing some speech, can sort of get practice hearing the words in relationship to the pictures and sort of start matching those together. And it's been really amazing. A lot of kids that I've seen using alternative communication have developed some spontaneous vocals just from, the repetition of hearing certain words over and over and being, having really, really high motivation for those objects. So, yeah, that's pretty much all there is to know about the PECS system. Of course, that's just sort of scratch the surface. Everything is different for every single learner, and, this PECS binder probably looks way different than, some PECS binders in use, and may be almost identical to other PECS binders that are in use. So it really just depends on your learner and what your learner needs in order to be successful with their communication and communicative intent. Thank you.